Chair Du Bois,
Here.
Councilmember Philseth,
Here.
Vice Mayor Koo.
Here.
For the record, all three present. Thank you.
Great. First item is oral communications. Someone from the public would like to speak to an item that's not otherwise on the agenda.
Chair Du Bois, we do not have any requests to speak.
Okay. And we did open things up, right?
Yes, the meeting is open up to the public.
Okay, so we have two action items tonight. The first item is on storm and surface water rates. Director Noze, you want to start with that one, item one?
Yes. So in item one, we should have Assistant Director Karen North. I'm looking on the participants.
I'm here.
Thank you. Who will be presenting this item. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. Finance Committee, this is Karen North, the Assistant Public Works Director. This is a fairly quick item. This is regarding the Stormwater Management Fee. I apologize. I was trying to be here the last one with all the fees to go at one time, but I was out of town. Next slide, please. So back in 2017, our voters voted for a stormwater management fee, and it was actually very clear. It makes it easy for staff that either we go from we increase it every year by the CPI, or we go to 6%. Next slide. And so the staff recommendation is that the Finance Committee recommends that Council adopt the attached resolution amending utility rate Schedule D1, which is in the staff report, to implement a 4.2% increase consistent with the applicable consumer price index, increasing the monthly charge from the equivalent residential unit ERU by 0.64. So it would basically go from $15.34 to $15.98, and it would increase our annual revenue for $312,000 for the stormwater budget. So if you want to put the if there's any questions.
Okay, seems pretty straightforward. Any questions from the Finance Committee? Or motions? Eric?
Maybe the answer to this is too complicated, but how much did our costs increase over this time?
Well, we basically project out the costs, and we're trying to build up the reserve because we have a lot of capital projects that are slated to come down the pipeline. So we know that the capital projects are increasing in costs. They're actually exceeding the CPI, but we're just going to try and see what we can fit in.
Thanks.
So not seeing, Lydia, you have a question?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and move the staff recommendation of an increase of 4.2%.
Second.
Okay, okay, so just go ahead and vote. Councilmember Koo?
Forward, right? Yeah.
Yep. Councilmember Philseth?
Yep.
And I'll vote yes, so that passes 3-0. And we'll move on to our second item, which is looking at development impact fees for park, community center, and library impact fees.
Yes, thank you, Chair Du Bois. We have a few staff members as well as our consultants on the line. So I believe Sarah Duffy from our Community Services Department is going to start us off and go from there.
Yes, thank you, Keith.
All right.
Thank you. I'm Sarah from the Community Services Department, and tonight we're bringing to you a report out on the supplement to the Park, Community Center, and Library Impact Fee Study.
I'm sorry, could you speak into your mic a little bit?
Yeah, is this, okay. Let me try it this way. This is a little bit easier to hear.
Yeah,
okay.
thanks.
So we're bringing to you tonight the supplemental report to the Park, Community Center, and Library Impact Fee Study. And this study considers some responses to some questions that were posed by council last year when the study was initially presented and the new fees were adopted. And so some of the topics covered in the study include a higher land valuation than previously presented. There's a comparison of different methods for calculating fees by square foot and by unit, and recommendations on deferring increases on fees to multi-unit family.
Sorry, Chair Du Bois, just a procedural point. I hate to interrupt this, but I think we missed public comment on the last item.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. So if anybody'd like to speak to item number 1, please raise your hand. I see one person, Rebecca Eisenberg.
Hi, thank you so much. I actually meant to speak at the community, open mic, I want to say, but I somehow missed it. But can I just give a shortened little bit about that? Would that be appropriate?
No, we moved on from that. We were on item 1.
Okay, yes, because I tried to raise my hand then, but I guess I missed it. So I will then agree to that, and I'll speak on the next issue instead. Thank you for considering, nonetheless.
Okay, so we're back to item 2.
Okay, thank you. I'll just pick back up. And the last main topic that the supplemental study will cover is a recommendation to defer increases to fees on multifamily housing until further economic feasibility studies can be completed. So we have DTA, which is the consulting firm that worked on the supplemental study. So I'm going to pass it over to David Tausig from DTA, and he'll go over their analysis and the results of their work, and then they'll turn it back over to me, and I'll go over the staff recommendations, and then we'll be available to answer any questions. So I'll turn it over to David now to go over the results.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Can you guys hear me? Am I on the mic?
Yep.
Okay, I'm not talking to myself. Good. Anyway, I'm David Tausig. I'm president of DTA. I work with Kyle Martinez, who is helping me by putting the slides on the screen in putting together basically an update to your existing park fee program, which we also worked on several years ago. And the key, I think, consideration here, there's several, which I'll talk about, but one of the main ones is the cost of land, which I think, as many of you know, has gone up significantly since we did our last study. So we're going to talk a little bit about the current fee schedule and what the recommendations were, what the fee levels were when we adopted the initial fees in 2021. We're going to talk about presentations that we made to the Parks and Recreation Commission and some recommendations that we made to them that we had general concurrence with. And then we're going to summarize our findings and then go through a series of recommendations. I do want to explain one thing to you to start with, and that is whenever you do one of these fee studies, the fee study itself justifies a maximum level of fees that you can charge. It's based on the full cost of providing the services, the facilities that are necessary. That applies to parks, roads, fire stations, libraries, whatever. So it's a maximum level. You, the council, or you three plus the other members of the city council, have an opportunity to adopt the program, but not necessarily go with fees at the maximum level, but possibly go to a lower level. What we do is we set the maximum. You cannot go higher than that. Many jurisdictions do apply the maximum fees, others for various reasons because they have other goals and objectives in a city or county, sometimes go with below the maximum level. So we can discuss that later also, but I want to keep that in your mind as we talk about these fee levels. So the first slide, I think, kind of summarizes where we are currently. Kyle, great. The rates that we're currently charging to new developments, single family homes, you see there's 3 components. There's park facilities, the community center, and then library facilities. Total fees for single family, $64,504 per dwelling unit. Multifamily is $47,707. And then we had 2 non-residential categories that we were given when we put this together several years ago. There's the commercial industrial fee, which is $18.91 essentially per new square foot. And then hotel motel is $3.22. per square foot. So those are the four numbers that are being levied today. When you implement development impact fees, when a developer comes in, pulls a building permit, these are the charges that they pay. Next slide. So we were asked to do a number of things. First, to update the land acquisition costs, because since the last time we adopted fees, we had lower land costs. In addition, there was some question as to the data that was collected for the original fees that I just discussed that were on the prior page. So we wanted to take another hard look at what land costs have been over the last year or two and see whether we should be increasing those land costs to be commensurate with the actual cost of land, because the city would have to go out, purchase a piece of property, and then build that into a park. And they would have to pay the ongoing prices, current market prices, not prices from a number of years ago if they purchased such land. Secondly, as you saw before, we had fees listed for two commercial types of property. One was commercial industrial, which was put into one category, and a second was hotel motel. And the idea was to take the commercial industrial category and break it into two separate areas, retail versus office, because the amount of park usage related to those particular types of land uses differ between retail and office. So we were asked to come up with new fee levels, retail being separated from office. Third, when we did the commercial industrial fees before, we had an office density, I believe it was 240 square feet per employee. And there was some discussion as to whether the number of employees per square foot in an office building actually wind up having more employees, which would mean there's a lower square footage per employee. And in looking at some new numbers, and we'll talk about this in a minute, we lowered the number of square feet per employee in an office building to 200 square feet per employee instead of, I think it was 240 was the prior figure. So that increased density of number of employees means increased usage of parks. So that would raise what the fee would be per office space by going with a higher density of employees per 1,000 square feet of building. Item D was to recommend a frequency for fee study updates. There is a new law that was adopted by the state that started application as of January 1st, 2022, which is this year. And they recommend that fee studies do no less than once every 8 years. So the discussion was to come up with some plan for when the city would look next at the number of, at the fee levels that we'd be currently recommending and update those at some point in the future. Just so you know, we do have an annual escalator in every year that increases the fees based upon, usually it's the consumer price index or something called the engineering news record construction cost index. And those increases tend to be, depending on what inflation is, generally between 2% and 4 or 5% per year. The concept here was when you went back and took another look at it in whatever number of years it is before we do another fee study, we could actually include all of the costs of building a park at that particular point in time. And it's very possible that the escalation rates that we put into this particular fee study might not be sufficient to cover the actual increased costs of, for instance, buying land or doing construction and building a new park. So you do want to take a new, even though you have an escalator that increases your rates, your fees every year, that often doesn't cover all of the additional costs that might be going on in the real world. And so you do have to go back and do another fee study in order to increase fees beyond that escalation rate. And again, you can do it very quickly in 2 years if you think prices or costs have gone up significantly, or you can wait a longer period of time. But as I mentioned, under AB 602, the recommendation is do not wait any longer than 8 years for doing a new fee study. So that's part of the thought process that went into that item D. Item E is evaluate single multifamily fee structure. There's a lot of interest now in, and actually this new law talks about coming up with a fee structure that instead of being based on one fee for a single family home and one fee for multifamily home, having a fee that applies per square foot of floor space. The idea here being that we'll have a greater use of parks, or have a greater need for parks than a single family home of 1,500 square feet. Therefore, the fee should be higher for larger homes and less for smaller homes. And the same applies to multifamily. If you have a 600 square foot studio apartment, should it pay the same multifamily rate as a 2,000 square foot townhome? They're both attached multifamily properties, but the 2,000 square foot townhome probably has a greater need for parks because it has a larger household living within it. In addition, the cost of the 2,000 square foot townhome would be much greater than the cost of a 600 square foot studio to construct, and therefore might be able to handle a slightly higher fee because there's more of a price to encompass that fee with a larger townhome. So that was the issue we looked at with item E. And then item F is evaluating free credit options for below market rate units. The fees even now are high enough to make it very difficult to build affordable housing. These new fees based on higher land costs will be higher, and therefore will be more of an imposition on affordable housing and workforce housing. So the question is, should we think about possibly having some type of fee credit where if you satisfied certain affordable housing income requirements and enter the 55-year lock-in on rents that are required, or 35-year depending on the city, to qualify as affordable housing, that you would get a break and you'd be able to pay a lower park fee because there'd be a discount based on the fact that you are building affordable housing. So that's that page. Move on to the next. Okay, just to let you know where we stand on all this, and of course I already gave up some of my information, but under item A, update land acquisition costs, we have several recommendations that we can make to you, or several alternative options that you have. They make a very large difference on the amount of the fee. So we are going to make recommendations and discuss the issues today. We haven't really resolved anything in particular regarding that issue, other than we want to make a recommendation, but ultimately the city council would decide which fee to go with. So, but we do want to talk about that more during this presentation. Differentiating the fee structure for retail versus office. As I said, we've already come up with some recommendations there that are based on the number of employees per square foot in an office building versus in a retail building. And we now have different fees for office versus retail, and I will cover those in a minute. Updating the office density, as I mentioned before, we did drop from, I believe it was 240 square feet per employee to 200. So that ultimately generated higher fees for office space, and I'll show you those in a few minutes. The recommending frequency for fee study updates, I just gave you kind of a background. You can update whenever you feel you need to. The city council feels they want to go back and redo it, but also the finance committee can consider and come up with a time period. We are recommending every 5 years, but again, that would be up to you as to whether you wanted to wait a longer period of time, which means you don't get an opportunity to update the fees as quickly. On the other hand, it's certainly less work and less cost to just go with an escalator every year. But unfortunately, you may not get enough money to build parks. So that's the trade-off. And most cities don't do it every 2 years. They usually wait to every 4 or 5 years at a minimum. So item E, evaluate single multifamily fee structure. We will talk about that and some of the options that we want to show you. And then finally, evaluating the free credit options. We do have some recommendations there also. Again, it would be up to the city council at the end, but we will cover that item a few slides from now. Next page. Okay, so differentiating the fee structure for retail versus office. Okay, it was 260 square feet per employee. You can see in that last bullet, item, I don't know what you call it, the last item that shows that you're separating office into from residential. We would adjust the density from 260 square feet per employee to 200 square feet per employee. So what that does is it increases the amount that an office would pay, building would pay per square foot by about 30%. Because office is taking on more of the burden now, retail can take on less of a burden because they have fewer employees per square foot. So the retail ends up decreasing about 41%. The industrial overall decreases by 12%, again, because office is taking on more. And then we set up a fourth category because not all commercial properties would fall into retail, office, or industrial. The city has its own code for various commercial categories, zoning and planning codes. And we have an other commercial fee that would apply for anything that would not qualify as retail, office, or industrial under the city's codes. And that amount would be the average of the other three, since we don't have a specific category that's not one of those three. It's not a type like a retail or office or industrial. It could be institutional, it could be senior housing. There are a lot of possibilities. And so we have that as an other commercial category. So we now have 4 commercial categories: retail, office, industrial, and other commercial. That is different than what we've had before. And the ultimate effect that has on the amount of fees that we impose, we'll again show you in a couple of slides. Next slide. She can't
This is
change.
the next one. This is just the one with the 17.6 million scenario.
Right, that's the one that we just did before, right? 7 or 8. I'm looking at the top. Oh, I'm sorry, I got it. Okay, yeah, this is the next page. Sorry. Yes. So the question is, how much money are we going to get from each of these types of uses? Because we have a certain projection for the number of retail amount of retail square footage versus office square footage versus industrial, we take those increases in fees and we look at the total amount that would be generated. And the number that we show here is the one based on a very high cost of building parks and purchasing land, which is 17.6 million per acre. If we did that and we apply the new fees to that, we would have retail fee increases of 24% in total. As I said, the fee actually went down per unit, but with the amount of retail that's projected, there would be a 24% increase in retail fees. Office, there's an increase in the fee per square foot, plus additional office that would be built. So it'd be 171% increase in the office fees that are collected overall. Industrial fees would be up by 83%. Again, the cost per industrial square foot is down, but because there's more industrial being projected, there'd be an increase of 83% of revenues coming in. And then other commercial, we did not actually make a particular, it was very difficult to project what kind of development that was going to be exactly. So we don't have a number for that, but you can see that overall there is because we've decreased because we've increased the fees on office space, the total amount of revenues generated will be substantially more because office and retail and industrial will all generate more due to the amount of development occurring, and office will go up the most because in addition to the amount of office space being constructed, we also have an increase in the cost per square foot, as I showed you before. Okay, next page. That's the one I was waiting for. Okay, so frequency and updates. I think I talked to you before about how we have the Engineering News Record or Consumer Price Index. CCI stands for Construction Cost Index. We have those that go up every year, so there will be an increase every year. But to actually true up the fee levels to encompass what new land costs are and new costs of developing parks, updating the fee study as a whole is probably a good idea. And we'd be recommending somewhere between every 5 years, which I think is frequently enough to catch a lot of the changes that occur, and 8 years, which is what the new Assembly Bill 602 adopted by the state legislature recommends starting on January 1st, 2022. In terms of single family, multifamily structure, the idea of going per square foot used to be optional. And to be honest, other than school fees, we've been doing these fees programs since 1989. Almost all fees are based on single family home versus multifamily home. Sometimes we break out apartments from condos and that sort of thing, but we very rarely get into per square foot fees, except with schools, which is not something the city gets involved in, where there is a requirement that you base it on square footage. Well, what's happened now is under this new AB 602, as of July 1st, 2022, which is coming up in a couple of months, you would have to base the fees on square footage because the state felt that was a fairer way to impact or impose fees. And so you'd be required to implement on a per square foot basis. There's a short period of time here where if you adopted this fee study before July 1st, you would essentially be grandfathered in under the old rules, and we could have a charge for single family home and not multifamily home, but not broken into square footage. However, if we adopt this fee study after July 1st, and again, that's less than 2 months from now, you'd be required legally to do it on a per square foot basis. And that will be applied in the state from July 1st, 2022 on for every future fee, at least the way the law is was adopted right now. So we would be going with a cost per square foot of floor space as opposed to per single family home and per multifamily home. And then with credit options, I know, when you build affordable housing, a lot of times there are development agreements or other kinds of density bonuses, whatever that you've worked out to allow for below market rate units. And we'd have to discuss more how to do that. You have the possibility, we do this in some cities, of completely waiving the fee if it's a park fee for affordable housing. In other cases, there's a 50% reduction, or there's a phase in where the first year it's 25% of the total, next year 50, 75, and 100 over a 4-year period to give affordable housing developers time to understand what's going to be happening with fees rather than just suddenly imposing them at a higher level. All those options are available. Again, we're only showing you the maximum amount we can charge per dwelling unit. You can charge less for any type of development that you think might want to be different. I will say that historically, not so much today because the world has changed, but because sales taxes were so important, we saw all kinds of cities reducing the fee levels intentionally just for retail development to encourage more retail, because fiscally it was so important to cities. It's still important to cities fiscally, but it's not as important as it was before. But there is a tradition or a precedent of doing something like that for one land use versus other land uses. And affordable housing certainly would be a suitable land use to consider the possibility of having a lower fee. Next slide. Okay, updating land acquisition costs. So this is, there are a lot of options here, and I need to explain that we always have this problem when we go into a city, unless it's, San Francisco or LA or San Jose, which is very, very large, of getting enough data points to come up with a good valuation. Clearly, if you look at the land costs over the last 6 months, they'd be higher than they were in the past. But if we look at the last 6 months of sales, you might wind up with 11 or 12 or 15 sales of homes. Often it's not enough to really create a judgment. And you have to understand that here, we're not looking at you going out and buying a parcel on a piece of property where there's a very large, expensive single family home. You're more likely to look at either vacant property or property that is underutilized, maybe industrial property that has an old use on it that you would consider a tear down property that you'd be able to tear down the facility on it and build a park. And the cost wouldn't be that extreme. Obviously, if you bought a expensive property, a series of properties, single family homes that are expensive, just paying for that property would be a lot. And then you just demolish what was on it, which really would be a costly way to build a park. So we don't think you'll be doing that. So we tried to come up with some other source. So first we looked at vacant land sales. We kind of went over the last 12 months and looked to see all the vacant land sales we have. And I want to warn you that this is a situation, again, where it just depends on how many pieces of vacant property were sold. And if there were several outliers on the low side or the upside, that would drag up or drag down what the average cost of land would be. So we took a look at what we found out there, and coming up with an average cost of $6.5 million per acre for vacant land sold over the last 12 months. Again, maybe the number of data points were not sufficient, but this is accurate information for the last 12 months. So we ended up having a cost for the land acquisition of $6.5 million per acre, which is essentially a 9.3% increase in the land costs. And as you might expect, the increase in the cost of pulling a building permit in terms of paying for park fees would be 9.37% based on just the land cost increase. So you can see single family residential would go up from 57,420 to 62,802. You can see multifamily would go up from 42,468 to 46,448. Commercial industrial, I'm just doing a comparison of apples and apples, which is what we had before versus what we would have now had we kept the same categories of land uses. Commercial industrial would be going up to 1841 from 1683, and then a hotel motel up to $3.13 versus $2.87. So that would be the increase based on just looking at the last 12 months of vacant land. Next slide. Okay, so then we took a look and we actually had to go back. So looking at tear down properties, we had to go back farther to find enough of them to make it a sizable database to give us a number. And when we did that, we actually went back, I believe, Kyle, was it 5 years we went back for this? I'm trying to remember on the.
That's correct.
5 years, we went back 5 years, and the cost there, and again, there could have been a few outliers, but we had to go back 5 years to get enough sales of what we consider kind of, I guess, tear down property, underutilized property, was 17.6 million per acre, obviously substantially more than 5.7 million per acre. So if you take a look, that's actually a increase of 141.62%. So it's more than doubling what the land costs are, and just providing, again, the same four categories. So we're comparing apples and apples, the same four land use categories we used last time out. You can see the increases are much more substantial, 57,400 for a single family detached home to 138,700. Multifamily 42,004 versus 102,613. And then you can see the major increases, again, more than doubling for the commercial industrial category and the hotel motel category. Now, these are supportable in the sense that 17.6 million is the cost of tear down property, and using tear down property as an example of the kind of property you would purchase if you were going to buy a piece of land and build a new and develop a new park, that's also appropriate. So there's nothing wrong with the number, but clearly the city may have other policies regarding affordable housing and a number of other issues that having such a high rate, again, 102,000 per apartment is quite a bit of money. So it would make it more difficult to build apartments that could be sold at what current rents are. It would certainly make it even more difficult to build affordable apartments. So, that is all a factor you have to take into consideration. So I will say this, it's justifiable based on the numbers, but it may not serve other city purposes and other goals and objectives the city has. So again, this is an alternative that's available, but it is very much higher than it was before. And it is justifiable and defensible, but it's also a very, very high fee. Next slide. So just comparing land costs, and obviously Palo Alto, is a very high priced community, but we took a look at land valuations comparing what other jurisdictions used in doing their fee studies and the 17.6 million that we came out with. And also the 6.5 million, which was the one that was based on vacant land sales over the last 12 months. So questionable data points because there are not a lot of them. But anyway, you can see the difference in land costs. And the only thing that's really comparable, I would say, to Palo Alto would be Los Altos. And they used a figure that looks like it's almost 12 million a year, 12 million per acre, maybe a little bit more than 11 million per acre. And then you can see all the other cities, all of them have park fees. All of them had to document land costs for their park fees. Some were done a number of years ago. Some were done just last year. We happen to be working for the city of San Jose right now on doing their park fee study. So their number will be going up. But the point is that this is a comparison of the city of Palo Alto land costs per acre for park fee purposes versus other jurisdictions. Next slide. Okay, so just taking a 57 unit development and looking at what the fees would be, you can see that the total would be about 4 million per unit under the old program, a little bit less than 4 million. I kind of can't read it here, but anyway, 42,468 per unit under the current program. If we went up to $6.5 million per acre, we'd be at 46,448 per unit. And then for the last scenario of 17.6 would be 102,613. And if you kind of look at the y-axis on the graph, you can see it would be about 4 million in fees total for the current program. A little bit more than that. Actually, looks like about 3.5 million. Look exactly for the current fee program. Go up to about 4 million if we increase the fees based on a $6.5 million per acre cost. And then finally, looking at the newest figure, the 17.6 million for that same 57 unit building, the total fees would be somewhere around $7 million. So you can see it's a considerable difference. This is for 57 units. It's not like a fourplex, but it is a considerable difference in the fee levels per unit. And then of course, overall for the 57 units. Next slide. Okay, so when we talked before about the necessity of going to a per square foot fee rather than an overall per unit fee, obviously the key factor there is how many square feet you have per unit. And what you do when you come out with a fee level is you take the fee level per single family home or the fee level per multifamily home, which we just talked about, and you divide it by the average number of square feet in a single family home or multifamily home. That comes up with a per square foot fee for a single family home, multifamily home. And then you apply that to whatever is on the building permit in terms of square footage. So using the average blended square footage, if we only had, we didn't have a separate fee for single family homes versus multifamily, but the city, which you can do, but the city decided instead, let's just have one average per square foot that applies to single family, multifamily. We developed a weighted average of the 2154 square feet and the 1255 square feet, which were the numbers we actually pulled off the internet for average square footage. We went and looked at 40 homes that were sold over the last year or two that were single family, about 40 units that were multifamily, and we saw the average size was 2154 for a single family home and 1255 for multifamily home. We took a number of both of those that were constructed, and we came up with a weighted average of 1,755 square feet per unit. And so what we did was we took the estimated residential park fee for single family home and multifamily home, divided it by 1,755, and we came out with estimated cost per square foot of $28.93 per square foot for a residential building based on the $5.7 million land valuation. Again, that was our existing level. We've got 6.5 million for the proposed increased level based on vacant land sales over the last 12 months. So that's $31.64 per square foot. And then the high figure based on the last 5 years of tear down property, as we called it, 17.6 million, which would be $69.61 per square foot. So taking a typical single family home that would come online, that's 2,154 square feet, the amount of the fee that would be charged for the entire unit based on those square footage numbers that we just gave you would be $62,300 under the current fee program, $68,164 under the recommended program, which increases land values to $6.5 million. And then if we went all the way to the 17.6 million, the cost per single family home would be $150,588 per single family home. And again, that is justifiable, but it's based on this much higher land cost, which if it's a valid land cost means it's valid. On multifamily, just taking a typical 1,255 square foot unit, multiplying that by the same amount of fees per square foot, the 5.7 million would generate a cost of fee of $36,317. The 6.5 million land cost would generate a fee of $39,721. And finally, the $17.6 million cost of land would generate a fee of $87,000. So obviously, we'd be going from $36,317 today to $87,752 if we went with the 17.6 million, and if the council decided, yes, we want to actually implement this maximum level, the fee would be $87,752 per unit. Next slide. Just breaking down the fee summary based on the 6.5 million per acre. As I said, we now have the 4 categories of commercial industrial, plus we have the hotel category. And you can see that assuming we went with the 6.5 million per acre, the typical cost, again, we're not breaking down per square foot now, I'm just showing you per unit, although we may have to go to per square foot if we do this after July 1st, if the study's approved after July 1st. It'd be 69,886 per unit for a single family home, 51,687 for multifamily. And then you can see per net square foot for all the various non-residential uses, what the fees would be. So that would be at that level. The 17.6 million, obviously numbers would be much higher. You'd have 145,826 for a typical single family home, 107,852 for a multifamily. And then again, the cost would all be higher per square foot for the new 5 categories that we have of various non-residential development, ranging from $51.18 per square foot for office, down to a low of $7.28 per square foot for hotel and motel. Next slide. So finally, I know this has been a lengthy presentation, but we have plenty of time for questions. So in terms of our recommendations, and again, this is totally up to the city council, we just felt for purposes of if the city has other goals, that perhaps update your land valuation from 5.7 million to 6.5 million. So you have an increase. But it's not so substantial that it impacts what kind of development can occur in your city. We do agree separating the commercial industrial fee into retail, office, industrial, and commercial makes it more fair because somebody building one of those uses would not be dragged up or dragged down by the other uses that happen to be in that same category. We'd have those 4 separate commercial industrial uses plus hotel, and they'd all be separated. We've updated the office density and taken it down to the 200 square feet per unit. So we think that works. Fee study updates, we've discussed that every 5 to 8 years. Again, you don't have to make a policy now that you have to stick with forever, but you could start out with every 5 years and then decide if you have to do it more quickly for some reason. And then updating fee schedule with all the above recommendations. Again, if it's after July 1st that we adopt this, there's no choice in the matter. But anyway, converting it to a square foot calculation because that's what the law requires. And if it requires it, that's how we have to implement it after July 1st. Again, if we adopted this plan before July 1st, we could then be grandfathered in with whatever fees you wanted to charge after that. So you still have that option, although obviously we're getting pretty close to the deadline. And then item F had to do with what to do with affordable housing and whether or not workforce housing, whether or not to have a lower fee. And we figured that's really something the city has to decide in terms of its overall housing goals and how this parks fee figures into those overall housing goals. And I think that is the last slide, I hope. Yes, it is. So anyway, appreciate the time you spent listening to me, and we're here to answer all the questions you've got. Hopefully we've got answers for all of them. And I'm so glad we had such a great cooperation from the city in putting this together. We really couldn't have done it without their help. So we really appreciate city staff.
All right. Thank you, David. Let's go to the members of the public, see if there are any public comments on this item. Yeah, I'm only seeing one hand, which is Rebecca Eisenberg. You'll have 3 minutes.
Hi, thank you so much. So as maybe or not you noticed, I am a financial law nerd. I've been married for almost 22 years. And I remember like last year, my husband, Curtis Moeller, said to me, wow, this is the first day in a decade I remember going by without you mentioning Prop 13. So I'm really, really into this stuff. And given all that, I want to thank from the bottom of my heart the presenter whose name I didn't catch. I think he did a fantastic job. I also want to thank city staff. I think that this analysis, and I'm so sorry I'm not there in person. I want to hold up a whiteboard. I think that this analysis is so spot on and it's so important and it's so well done. And just a couple things I'd really love for your committee to think about and consider, because I know I am 100% positive that we have shared goals here to do what is in the best interest in the community. And I think this analysis is absolutely a great start. So with that said, I think what's really important here is this focus on density. And density is so important because density is the way to measure the externalities. Remember from, Econ 101, externality are the impacts on our economy from companies and businesses that we can't measure. They're externalities on the market. And it's density that creates this externality. When companies have 10,000 employees or a private school has 500 students and 150 teachers in the middle of a residential neighborhood, that number of students, those new employees, that density is what impacts our community. Organization in the middle of a residential community, like most of Palo Alto used to be, measuring the number of people there is the right way to go, especially when those people are commuting in. Like, for example, teachers that are teaching at Castellea, if they get to expand. That is the right way to analyze it. So the only reason that, and I'm trying so hard to get this done, the only reason that the law, in my understanding and my training, again, legal finance nerd, the only reason the law really uses square footage is that square footage is a good way to estimate density, often, but not all the time. And really the best way to measure density is to measure density. And how do you measure density? For a company, you measure headcount. And if you want to make that a progressive way of measuring headcount, you measure payroll, because payroll is headcount times the amount each employee is paid. That measures both income, ability to pay, and density, the number of people impacted. Please let me just finish the sentence. I'm the only speaker. Please, I beg you. Please. So I'm saying, thank you. And I was really good about not having time before. I just want to circle this up and say, this analysis that was given is so important and so perfect. And I hope that you can apply it to all things like the business tax. Remember, square footage doesn't impact our community if it's empty. Density does. Thank you so much for considering. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is a six recommendations, I think.
It is. So, and Chair, if I might have Sarah help sum it up for you to help navigate the conversation ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We actually typed up the recommendations to walk through them quickly here. So if you move to the next slide, thank you. So there are several recommendations. The first one is, and these are staff recommendations, so different from DTA's recommendations, but based off of their study. Recommendation 1 is recommending the Finance Committee recommend to Council to approve the following from the supplement to the fee study. A, differentiate the commercial industrial fee structure into the 4 separate categories that David went over: retail, office, industrial, and commercial. B, maintain the office density calculation of 200 square feet per employee. And C, update the fee study every 5 to 8 years in accordance with the requirements in AB 602. Next slide, please. Okay, recommendation 2 is that Finance Committee recommend to Council to select and apply one of the following land valuations for use in calculating the park development impact fees. A, maintain the current $5.7 million per acre valuation. B, increase the land valuation to the $6.5 million per acre based on the last 12 months of vacant Palo Alto property sales data. Or C, increase the land valuation to $17.6 million per acre based on the average of the last 5 years of underutilized Palo Alto property sales data. And recommendations 5 and 6 relate to recommendation 2. So 5, if applicable, based on recommendation 2, direct staff to implement the new approved fee levels as part of the FY23 budget process. 6, if applicable, based on recommendation 2, adopt an ordinance to update the fair market value per acre of land for the park land in lieu fee in Muni Code section 21.50.070. And then last slide, thank you. Recommendations 3 and 4 are that Finance Committee recommend to Council to on whether to convert residential fees to reflect a per square foot amount rather than the single amount per dwelling, regardless of size. And recommendation 4, defer any development impact fee increase on multifamily housing and direct staff to prepare an economic feasibility study to evaluate the potential impact of higher fees on housing production and other development across the board. So those are the recommendations. And I will stop there, and I think we can move on to questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So I think if we use this sheet with the recommendations, I think there's going to be see lights for questions, comments. So maybe we'll do a couple of rounds of questions. And then I thought maybe we could work through these in the order in the slides, but let's start with questions and comments. And Eric, you want to go ahead? Your light was on.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much. This covers a lot of territory and a lot of stuff here. So this is we're going to do our job today. Couple questions first. How is the commercial linkage reckoned to park space? I get the residential. How do you link? What's the linkage algorithm for commercial square footage to park impacts?
Should I answer that? So we base it on employees per square foot, and we say the amount of benefit that an employee has is about 18% of the benefit that a resident has. And that all has to do with the number of hours that a resident who is there 7 days a week can go all day on weekends and can after school or before school or after work or before work can use the parks versus an employee who's actually coming there may use it an hour before work, an hour during lunch, an hour after work. So the number of hours that an employee has exposed to a local park would be 5 days, 3 hours a day is 15 hours a week versus a resident who's there all weekend and also has access when they're not working during the day, during the week or not at school. So the number comes out to be about 18%. We didn't invent that number. It's something that's used pretty as a standard basis in our business. And so every employee uses 18% of the amount of park that a resident does. And we know the number of employees per square foot, as we just talked about, depending upon the type of use. So that's where the employee fees come from. Obviously much lower than residential because they have much lower use, but they do have use. And it's interesting, last thing, this is something called the Quimby Act that's been around since I think 1952. That was the old way they paid for parks. They didn't even allow you to put a fee on commercial industrial. So this idea of charging commercial industrial as part of AB 1600, which is the California Mitigation Act, where they recognize that you could apply park fees and other types of fees to places of employment because there is some usage there. You just have to document what that usage is.
Got it. Thanks. That's very helpful.
Sure.
So basically 1 employee for each 5 residents or something.
Yes, basically that's correct.
Okay. Next question. Let me ask a question of staff. So a bunch of discussion about discounting and crediting for affordable housing. Right now, we waive all kinds of fees for affordable housing, but what's our criteria for that? I mean, is it 80% AMI? I mean, I assume we enter into an agreement where they deed restrict for a certain number of years, but what definition of affordable housing do we use? Is it 80% AMI or 100% AMI or 120% AMI? And if they're 79% AMI, all fees are waived, and if they're 81%, then no fees are waived. I mean, how does it work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John, do you want to answer that question? If you're on the call.
Thank you, council member. I have to take a look at our chart. I know that for our local ordinance, we do define affordable to include 100 and 120. I need to look at the development impact fees to see how that's broken down. So let me look into that and get back to you unless Molly has that off the top of her. No, she doesn't. Okay, so let me follow up on that.
Tim Shimizu from my office has some information.
Oh, great.
Good evening. So under the municipal code for these specific impact fees, residential housing that is 100% affordable, which is, and recorded that way, and is permanently obligated to be that way, is waived from the park, library, and community center fees. In addition to below market rate housing that is above and beyond the minimum number required for projects under that ordinance.
Could I follow up on that while we're on this topic?
Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry, above the BMR requirement, but what definition of affordable do we use?
Yeah. So we need to look at that piece. Yeah.
But I don't know that Finance Committee needs to know that tonight. I think that, as we go down this path and so forth, I think it's important that we in council understand it, at the appropriate time when we set policies here, right? Okay. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, so you said 100% affordable or building the required amount, which I assume is 15%? Or exceeding the required amount?
So it's the amount that exceeds the required amount is exempt from these impacts.
So it seems like the 100% doesn't really apply. It's really, and it kind of gets to Councilmember Phil Seth's question earlier. Are the fees waived only if they build the units? If they pay an in lieu fee, are fees included or not included?
So,
Jonathan, do you know the answer to that?
yeah, so I'm just trying to understand, Councilmember, for which housing type that you're talking about.
So let's say it's multifamily with a 15% requirement. If they exceed it, they don't have to pay the park impact fee, it sounds like.
For those affordable units that are exceeding the 15% requirement.
So they would pay impact fees for the first 15%.
Right. So in other words, if the requirement is 15% affordable, but they have 16% affordable, then 1% of the affordable doesn't pay impact fees. If I heard that right.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay, that makes more sense, I think.
Okay, let me ask another question about AB 602. Is that a recommendation or a legal requirement? And part of my question is that actually, it sounds like it's legal. Is it actually legal because it's a nexus issue and sort of the nexus would be to people as opposed to square footage? So are we required to follow AB 602 or is there anything that prevents us from following it?
As to the square footage requirement?
Yeah. That is to define impact fees on a per square foot basis as opposed to per housing unit basis.
So under AB 602, any agencies, including our city, that passes a nexus study after July 1st of this year has to then base their actual fee for housing units on a per square foot basis.
And that's for all impact fees related to housing units?
Yes, that are based on nexus studies adopted after July 1st.
Adopted after.
So if you pass the next study before that, you don't have to.
I think I actually like that better than the way we do it today, okay, for a variety of reasons. But there's a few bits and pieces that I have to think through why that makes sense. Okay. That's probably it for my questions for the moment.
Okay. Councilmember Koo.
So I just need clarification. The new law with the square footage, you said if we pass the linkage fee or the study after the July 1st, then we have to follow the square footage law. But if we pass it now, we don't have to comply?
So the square footage, the housing fee based on a square footage basis depends on when you adopt the Nexus study. So if you adopt this Nexus study update before or on July 1st, you have a choice of whether to keep the housing fees based on a per unit or square footage basis. If you adopt this update to the Nexus study after July 1st of this year, then the fee for housing has to be on a square footage basis going forward.
And when we do, so say, for example, we do an updated in 5 years, right? At that point, we would have to change over?
Yes, so basically, whenever you adopt the next Nexus study after July 1st is when you have to switch to a square footage basis.
I see. Okay, thank you. That helps. So in the example earlier, in terms of when does the impact fee apply? And you said 100% affordable, or when you exceed, or the units that exceed the BMR requirement. So when it's 100% affordable, that would mean something like 120% AMI. If they built that and it's 100% affordable, that would mean that they would be waived.
John,
Look
can you
at
help
me.
us with the affordability levels, or Sarah?
Yeah, Jonathan, if you could.
Yep.
That would be great.
So that's an interesting question. So just to answer the previous question about the affordability level, the code does stipulate that an affordable unit means a dwelling unit affordable to very low, or moderate income households. And I believe we have moderate at 120 AMI. I'm sorry, I got to double check that too, but it's either the 100 or the 120 AMI. Vice Mayor, to your question about if it was all at 120 AMI, that actually doesn't meet our inclusionary requirement, because some of those units would have to be for at least for townhome development, condominiums. Some of that would have to be at 100%. But
I'm sorry, I don't understand
I think the short answer is that they're at the higher income levels than I think you and your colleagues have been sort of talking about.
So if I could,
60 or 80% AMI.
if I could help clarify that, we have a formula, right, for your 15%, and it has to be made up of a certain percentage of units at different income levels. And I think all of them at 120 doesn't qualify.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
But I think maybe 50% at 100 and 50% at 120 may qualify. I'm not sure. We should really check. I don't know if the 120 was only for the workforce housing, or is that also for our BMR 100% affordable?
Well, workforce housing is a very limited applicability. I don't know that I would use that for a lot of policy making guidance.
Okay.
And that went up to 140, 130 and 140% AMI.
Okay.
Oh, so workforce housing it's been increased now?
Well, so workforce housing, as we've defined it through an overlay, a combining district, it has limited applicability to certain PF zone properties within a certain distance of, rail or something like that. So we had one workforce housing project in the city, and and it's a legislative action, so the council would have to vote to affirmatively apply it to another property. I just don't know that that's a model that we need to shape this policy on.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand, when the fees would apply in that one workforce housing project, should it come to us, but that's okay. We don't have to go into it. And thanks to Mr. Tosick.
Right.
Yeah, for the presentation. So 6.5 million is very far from 17.6 million. And then I think you were saying, or somebody was saying that well, actually the recommendation is if you increase land value to 6.5 million per acre based on the last 12 months of vacant Palo Alto property sales data. We don't have very much vacant property sales data now, do we?
David, can you speak to the?
No, that's
number
an
of-
excellent point. I think was right. The number of data points that we use to go back 12 months on vacant. I'm trying to remember. Do you remember, Kyle, was it 18 sales? How many sales was it that we based it on? I don't know if you have that on top of your head, but we only went back 12 months and we had about 18 of them. I believe it was 18. So again, some of them might have been particularly low. They might've been something particularly less useful about this vacant land, but that's the most current data we have on vacant land, which we assumed was most likely the type of land that you would want to take over. But obviously there are lots of properties that have, very low, very small, kind of rundown residential development. There's also property that has got industrial development on it, but at a very low floor area ratio. And there's actually a service that we subscribe to called CoStar, and they rank properties by 5 different categories. And category 1 is considered underutilized, most likely tear down or that sort of thing. So we decided, well, let's just go off of forget vacant property. Let's take a bigger category and let's go back more years so we have more data points. And that's where we came up with a much higher number, which is 17.6 million. Again, I don't know, Kyle, how many data points we had when we went back on the teardown. But again, some of the teardown property might, one person's teardown property might be somebody else's mansion. I don't know.
Right.
So that's always the issue. We don't know exactly what the property was. But anyway, we came out with 17.6 million under that ranking. And I think there were a couple of members of our committee who thought, hey, that sounds like a more reasonable number because land is so expensive in Palo Alto. So.
Right, which is why I'm kind of looking at the cities that were used in comparison. In real estate, we would have to do a lot of adjustments in order to make it comparable. But then also another question is when you talk about office, the office, so we have also R&D, research and development. So how does that fit in there under office? Or would they be considered in the same way for the fees?
There's actually, and maybe somebody from city staff can help me on this. There's actually a category. There were 4 different categories. Office was one of them. And I don't know exactly whether that included R&D or not. I would think R&D would be industrial based on my, generic definition. But or Kyle, can somebody help me on that and having the actual categories? What are considered office? The city has some kind of standard for that particular category?
I think Jonathan would probably be the best person to answer the categories if he knows offhand.
Well, yes, we do have a number of categories: general office, professional office, administrative office. We do have the research, R&D. I don't know for the study though, which one was used. So I think we'd have to take a look at that.
And so would we characterize all the ones that you named under office?
Certainly the first batch. I think there's a question about R&D. But I see Ms. Stump has her hand.
Yep. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, Member Koo. When you're done, I just have some comments.
Oh, okay.
We can look into whether R&D went into industrial or office. I can follow up on that.
We'll probably do a couple rounds of questions. Steve,
Okay,
do you have
yeah,
any others?
okay. Go
Okay.
ahead. I have to figure out my.
Right, thank you. So just raising up the conversation to a little bit of a higher level topic. You had a detailed presentation from the consultant really about the methodology. And that's very fine to start with that set of information, but you have your planning director here and two lawyers from your legal office for a reason. And that's because there are both regulatory and legal concerns that these study results push against. And so I can't let the conversation go too much more without noting that, so that the committee is just aware that we will need to assist you with those issues, depending on what the committee's interest is in terms of making a recommendation to council. Thanks.
Okay, if I could ask a couple questions. So page 7, when we talk about office density, it talks about finding 190 square foot based on 2012 data. And so I'm just wondering, how do we end up with a 200 square feet? 2012 seems like a long time ago.
David, do you want to?
Yeah, I have to correct Kyle on that. I thought it went from 260 down to 200, but Kyle, do you remember where the 200 came from? Because you guys did that work. I wasn't involved in it.
The 200 square feet is the existing office square footage within the city. So we use CoStar to basically pool all the square footage within the city of Palo Alto and divide that by the total number of office employees within the city as well. That brings us to about 200 square feet. It was previously higher because all the non-residential categories were rolled up into one. By separating them out, it automatically adjusted down because the square footage within the city was broken out into each respective land use category.
So where did the 190 come from?
I believe it's based on the number of employees in the city in office space divided by the amount of square footage of office space in the city, with the latter coming from CoStar. I don't know where the former came from. Was that from the city? Kyle,
so we're saying we found 190 and we're just rounding it to 200, or?
Kyle, I believe so. What was the number? Where did you get the number of employees? Was that from the city staff?
That was from the number of employees. That was from our demographic research that we confirmed with the city. The 190, which document was that referenced in? Just want to make sure I'm looking at this.
It's in the summary of the staff report, but it said it came from the U.S. General Service Administration's 2012 public sector survey.
Okay, that was, I'm sorry, that was research that was done by, I think it was one of the park commissioners last year. They had done some independent research and sent us various data points on what they think the actual density should be. So that was provided by them to us, the 190.
Okay. And then the staff report lists 5 categories. It breaks out hotels, and hotels are at a much lower impact fee rate. But then the recommendation only has 4 categories and doesn't separate it out hotel. And the other rate is quite a bit higher. So what's the recommendation in terms of hotels?
We have hotel in the presentation. Was it not in, at least in our presentation?
Yeah, it's not in the staff recommendation. So it's a question to staff, I think.
Okay, sorry.
I believe that will stay as is, right? Because that's separate from the office.
So we would actually have 5 categories. Is that the recommendation?
That's what we have, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
but
correct,
again, I'm looking at recommendation 1 from staff, which says we'll have 4 categories and doesn't list hotel. So I'm asking staff.
Yes, that would be an additional category.
Okay, so it was meant to be included.
Yes, I
Okay.
think so. Apologies.
And then a question about deferring multifamily. It seemed like the referral was really about what to do with BMR. I understand we're doing our housing element, but there's going to be a lot of items all at once coming at us with the housing element. And so I'm just wondering if for instance, we thought, as Councilmember Filsa said, that maybe square footage was a better metric. Why wouldn't we recommend that for both single family and multifamily market rate housing tonight?
Right. So I think you need to hear from the planning director. The issue with housing is not solely affordable housing. It's a whole layer of state regulations around production of housing of all types. John, can you help us?
Yeah, and I'll note, I don't think there's an issue with the square footage recommendation. That piece is fine. And in fact, I think that's probably heading in the right direction. But the concern is, part of the housing element is, and Ms. Stump's absolutely right. It's not just about affordable housing. We have to look at market rate housing, and to what extent do we have governmental constraints that impede housing. And one of the things that we're looking at as a part of the housing element are our current development impact fees, to see if that is somehow limiting the amount of multifamily housing that's being built in the city. And so the recommendation recognizes that and suggests let us study that further and rule out that, or at least come to an understanding as to what extent our impact fees are problematic in the production of housing. And certainly a doubling of the park impact fees is worrisome, I will say, from my perspective, when just talking to folks who build housing who are already concerned about the amount that we are charging today.
So we could raise single family impact fees, but not multifamily.
So Ms. Stump and her office may have some additional concerns about that, but from my perspective, that's not, it's net new housing, net new single family housing. We don't see a lot of that. And I'm certainly not relying on that for RENA numbers or things like that. So there may be another legal dimension to consider, but I don't have the same concern that I have for multifamily.
I mean, it seems like a really fundamental issue about a city's ability to charge impact fees for parks. And if we had a consistent square footage rate and just applied it to all market rate housing, whether it was single or multi-unit, we think that would cause a problem.
It depends. It depends on what the rate would be.
That's why we did the Nexus study, right?
Right, but that's the beginning of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. And so, right, so housing is the most critical issue, but there is a general layer of constitutional issue as well. And so that's typically addressed by adding another piece of information, which is the feasibility analysis. So up at the higher levels that your study has explored, you're going to want to do that, to add the feasibility piece.
So let's talk about the valuation then. So 17.6 million is a max. And I'm kind of equating this to like our Nexus study for housing impact fees, for example, right? Where we had a max, but then we dialed it back to what we thought was a feasible level. I mean, the report looks at these three levels, 5, 6, 17. But can we, and then Los Altos is an interesting data point kind of connected to Palo Alto at 11. So could we take the max to 17.6 and say, we're just going to back it off by 5 or 6 million?
Sorry. I think you're remembering the last time we were before you, where I believe we had both of those elements. We had the Nexus piece, which is what's before you tonight. And we also had a feasibility study. And I think you were encouraged to back off a little bit from that. John might help me if I'm not recalling correctly. So you don't have the feasibility piece at all yet. So the 17 million is the max from a Nexus perspective, but you don't have an analysis, and it requires some number crunching and data gathering. It's not something that can be done sort of here at the dais just looking at what other cities are doing. That doesn't give you the necessary analysis to support a feasibility argument in court if you were challenged.
Yeah, but I'm looking at staff recommendation 2 that we choose between 5.7, 6.5, and 17.6. And I'm asking, can we choose any number in between?
So if you're going to go up into the higher levels based on what the nexus is documenting, you should add feasibility analysis before you do that.
So I'm not sure where higher starts, but again, if we ended up at like 11, which is what Los Altos is at, where does that put us? Right.
I think if I might, from a layperson's perspective, add or try to add is we can't just choose a number. We would, in order to develop what that number would be, we need the second step of the feasibility study to inform what it would be. Right now, the data points we have are A, B, and C that are listed out here under recommendation 2. So there's some information as part of the Nexus study that guides us to these as feasible data points. And the second layer will be when you do the feasibility study, how does that compare to these? And then that will allow for discerning what the final figure is. But for right now, for the council, it's important to make an informed decision based on the data that we have thus far. So I would say it is probably okay in the future, once we go through the appropriate steps, to potentially choose a number other than the 3 that are listed. But right now we're here in terms of what we have.
So
Hopefully
again,
that's
I'm
helpful.
getting very confused. I thought Finance Committee was being asked to make a recommendation on the park impact fee based on these Nexus studies. It seems pretty clear we had a limited number of vacant lots. So we have a couple of low price per acre for Palo Alto. And then looking at developed properties, but tear down, they're obsolete. We had this much higher number. There's nothing in here about us recommending a feasibility study. So if we wanted to, I guess the recommendations don't seem in line with that. Like, why couldn't we say, the commercial 5 categories or whatever, we want to back off of the maximum, but again, 6.5 also seems low in terms of buying an acre of property. Yeah, but I'm just trying to get clarity on what we're being asked to do tonight.
So recommendation 4 actually is deferring on the increase and pausing and directing staff to prepare the economic feasibility
Just for multifamily,
studies.
but I'm talking about office and everything else, right? Hotel.
I see.
Aren't we being asked to decide tonight, make a recommendation? And you're saying we're locked into these 3 price points. We can't say, well, the max is 17, but we think that's too high. So let's go with 9 or,
Well, Finance Committee can recommend anything we want. Okay, it doesn't become policy
But
until
we do have
council
2
recommends
attorneys
it.
here for a reason tonight.
Yeah, but
So
the attorneys don't stop Finance Committee from recommending stuff. They may stop council from implementing something illegal, but
Clean
they
up
don't
the
stop.
mess afterwards.
So Councilmember Dubois, so just trying to channel your intuition. So the land valuation, you saw tonight, there are different methodologies of finding it. The 6.5 is based on vacant properties, and the 17 and change is based on what's called 1-star tear down properties. And so the Nexus study is important because it relies on actual, a repeatable methodology to generate that data. So it's not in the council's and the city's interest to just somehow pick a number lower than that to generate, therefore, a lower fee result. What is being recommended is that you pick the methodology that, based on staff's recommendation or, the other alternatives. And then from there, that sets the very maximum fee. And then staff can continue on to do an economic feasibility study, especially if you pick the high number of 17.6, to then give you a sense of what lower fee based on that potential maximum you would actually set the fee at.
yeah. And that's where I was trying to draw the analogy
Yeah.
to other impact fees, because that has not been the policy before, that we would go with the max and that we would back it off because, so again, it feels like 17.6 is closer to market rate. But I would prefer to back it off of that in terms of a recommendation to council.
So if that's the Finance Committee's goal, then Finance Committee can recommend that to council that council direct staff to continue this exercise by doing an economic feasibility study to examine the economic feasibility of all of the park impact fee impacts to the different categories, including multifamily housing, single family, and all of the new categories that you just heard about today. And that work would generally looks at like, I think the city went through this with their linkage fee in 2021, looks at the economic feasibility of these different projects, given sample development projects across these different categories and the kind of profit yields for sales or rental scenarios. And would give based on, market says, our developer has an expectation of this amount of profit for this type of project. When you set the fees at varying levels, does that come within that expectation?
So do we know if Los Altos did a feasibility study when they went to 11?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And their methodology was a little bit different. The city of Los Altos relied on, they use, I think, an assessor.
Yeah, I think, David, you had mentioned they used an appraisal approach.
Yeah.
If that's correct, David, for Los Altos.
So their methodology was a little bit different than looking at historical sales data.
Okay, I'll stop there and let others ask some questions.
I think their current rate of 11 or 12 and change is based on an original methodology of 10 that has increased over some time now based on inflation.
Eric, you have more questions?
Yeah. Well, let me start with the easy one first. I think recommendation 1 sounds great. Okay, let me ask a question on 1A on the four separate categories. Do we think there are going to be big differences between those?
David, do you want to take this one on?
Sure. Differences between what the types of uses and what the fees are?
Well, yeah, between what the fees are. That is, are industrial and commercial going to be really different from each other? Or, I mean, if 2 of them are going to be identical, then maybe we can reduce to 3 categories. That's the only question, right?
Yeah, I mean, whether people are going to not build something because of those fees, less likely with non-residential than with residential, to be honest. So it's not as significant. We sometimes have 1 non-residential and people are happy with that because it's parks, how much should non-residential pay? That's a political issue also, but I don't think the 4 categories versus 2 is that big a difference in terms of what development's going to occur. I think the residential fees being so high would be really, I think, what the biggest problem would be. But
I understand. Okay, and so then the next one is that's I think is straightforward, is the 200 square feet issue. I think you folks are taking the average, right? Which is because there's data for it, right? What we're trying to do is set impact fees, right? So what counts is not the average technically, but the marginal. Okay, it's like what's the next one? Actually, it's technically what's the average over the next 5 years till next time we do the study, right? And if the existing average has changed over time, then the average and the marginal aren't the same, right? So I think we need to keep that in mind as we go through this, right? Okay, so now it's the impact fees. So, I mean, the 5 and the 6.5, I guess, are, based on vacant and underutilized land, right? And so what the long-term end in mind is, we're trying to set what's the appropriate linkage between residential development and demand if we need to go add some park space. And that's sort of what we need to keep in mind. Okay, so vacant land, I mean, there isn't any in Palo Alto, okay? And underutilized land, there isn't any of that either. And if there is, it's probably mostly in places that don't really fit the comp plan criteria for where we need park space. I mean, it's going to be out next to Yemen's Auto Body on East Bayshore, which is not where the comp plan says we need park space. So the question that we're fundamentally asking here is, if we need to go buy some land for park space, how much is it going to cost, right? And it's not if we need to go buy some cheap land far away with nothing but Dutch windmills on it for park space, what's it cost? That's not what we're asking. We're asking if we need to go buy some park space for, as our comp plan directs us, as our city charter directs us to follow the comp plan, which directs us, then we need to go get a realistic number for that. And so, I mean, even 17.6 million sounds like it might be a little bit low, okay? But it's much closer to reality than 5 or 6, which brings up to the point that you folks accurately brought up, which is there's a difference between the nexus study and the feasibility, right? Okay. So I think for our purposes, and especially for the purposes of the nexus study, we needed to know the true cost. Okay. Now we may choose not to charge an impact fee that represents the true cost. Okay. That's a city hall decision, right? We do that. We already do that. We don't charge it for affordable housing project. We say it's all waived. Okay. But we need to know. Okay. And, you know, beggaring the nexus study in order to arrive backwards at the impact fee we want to charge is not a good way to do things. Okay. The larger context is we're in a sort of an interesting spot where, you know, who decides what zoning and impact fees and so forth are like in cities in California? Well, there isn't a clear answer to that, okay? Because it's a quickly complicating Gordian knot of stuff from the state and the cities and stuff like that. And I think what's important is we need to be really clean, okay? We need to know what the real numbers are, right? Because if we're sort of going, well, you know, we're going to set our clock 15 minutes ahead, but we're going to remember that, you know, we're always 5 minutes late. So I think it's really important that we not tell ourselves, that we not fib to ourselves what the cost is. Okay, we got to tell ourselves what the cost is. And then if we choose to discount it for some reason, I mean, that is our job as government, is to decide who pays for society, right? If we choose to discount it and somebody else pay the difference because somebody's going to pay eventually, and if it's not the developer, right, and their tenants, then it's going to be somebody else, okay? And if we choose to discount that and have somebody else pay, fine. Okay, but we need to be honest with ourselves and also with the people who elected us to come do this work on their behalf. Because, you know, this is a nerdy town we live in, okay? You know, if we go tell those people that land in Palo Alto is only worth $6 million an acre, the first thing they're going to say is, you guys are trying to hose us, okay? And they're probably right, okay? And it's not the job they sent us here to do. So I think we need to be straight with people, right, about what it really costs. So I think we need to be clean on this, right? And if the answer is land is $17.6 million an acre, then I think, you know, we have to acknowledge that. And if the feasibility study comes back and the state says, well, and by the way, I think the right way to deal with that is in the housing element, in the programs, which we're just getting into the programs in the housing element. If the answer is we can't build housing with a $17.6 million with an impact fee based on $17.6 million or whatever it was a square foot, right? It has to be this much a square foot instead. Then I think that belongs as a program in the housing element, right? If we're gonna make that, right? But you know, Sacramento, God bless them, gives people all kinds of conflicting directions. Okay, they mandate population growth and they mandate water reduction at the same time. Okay, they mandate everybody get a real ID, and then they don't provide the ability to get one. Right? I mean, Sacramento gives people all kinds of conflicting stuff. A very wise engineering manager once I heard say, "Son, don't put your body between the bullet and the code." Okay, I don't think we ought to put our body between Sacramento and the people who elected us here. Okay, I think we need to be straight with everybody and be as clean and straightforward as possible. And if the answer is the valuation is $17.6 million, then the valuation really is $17.6 million, and we shouldn't lie about that. And if Sacramento comes back and says, yeah, but you need to set your impact fee, you know, 40% lower than that, then we'll do that. Okay, if that's what it takes. That's the way I think we should approach this philosophically. I don't know what that means exactly in terms of, you know, structuring it so it's legally valid, but I think that's the way we should approach it. I think we should be transparent and open about the real cost. And I think the baseline should be, as we've said before, affordable housing, we subsidize. Market rate housing ought to pay for itself. And I think we ought to be as close to that as we can. And then to the extent that we need to do something different to meet our targets, let's do that. Okay, our state requirements. Let's do that, but let's be clear about what we did. Right? I think that's the way we ought to approach it.
So Liddy, do you have another round of questions? I was going to maybe suggest a format, but if you want to go again, that's fine.
I just want to make a comment, I agree with much of what Councilmember Philsef said. But I also want to say, we talk about housing all the time, but there is a factor of quality of life, and there needs to be a balance. So it's not just about housing, but what comes with housing. You still need the community centers, you still need the parks, you need the schools. I mean, schools are not part of this, but there's all these other features that is needed along with housing. And so just to focus in on housing and not address or acknowledge the true costs, the value of what we have, it is actually not addressing the issue that we're going to be faced with in the future. We're always going to be behind then, as we are already behind on parkland and our community centers and other spaces that a lot of the people enjoy, not just residents, people that come into this community enjoy, is in need of maintenance, is in need of upkeep, being rebuilt. So let's look at this and be truthful to what this Nexus study came back with. I just wanted to voice that.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest that we work off of this handout we got. We start with recommendation 1. We try to resolve it, pass it, and then we'll move on to the next page. So on recommendation 1, the one thing we haven't really talked about too much is the recommendation on how often to update the fees, the studies. I mean, 8 years is the max allowed by law. I would prefer to recommend something shorter. So I'm wondering how staff would react to a suggestion that we update this every 4 to 6 years.
I think that's fine, if that's what you'd like to do.
I think for the committee, the consideration is obviously these updates are not light bodies of work. So as you're making a recommendation and thinking about the intentions of it, just acknowledge that this typically is on a infrequent basis. Also from a capacity perspective, this will tie up your administrative team and CSD for a solid 9 months. So how frequently do you want to prioritize that?
I mean, it feels like there's some balance there that doing it more infrequently actually takes more work because the changes are bigger, right? And if we did it, if we said 4 to 6 years, like every 5 years, maybe the changes wouldn't be so dramatic. So that's
Understood.
my intuition, is that there's
Just
some
me
balance.
providing that context. Departments are not budgeted for these fee studies, the consultants that are used for them. So these are always come back as budget proposals for consulting resources. I don't know how much this one was,
This supplement was about 21,000.
the total study though.
The total study, I would have to look back on how much the original, I think it was around 50,000 for the original.
So just, again, I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that, just for context of your decision-making, awareness of the resources, both time as well as consulting is for your consideration.
So, I mean, I'll try to make a recommendation. So, recommendation 1, again, we're changing from 4 categories to 5. We would add hotel in there. We would maintain the density at 200 square feet for office. And I would suggest we update every 4 to 6 years.
Second.
May I ask a question?
Yep.
So are you comfortable with the category, the 5 separate categories then? I mean, they're so broad.
I mean, yeah, looking at the table, the fees actually seem pretty significantly different. Office is about twice as much as retail. And again, it's based on employees and use through the equations there. Industrial is in between. Hotel is quite a bit less. So I think it's built on these models about how much these employees would use parks,
Yeah.
community centers and libraries. So it seems reasonable to
And
me.
you're looking at table 4?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions or comments on this one? Can we go ahead and vote? So Councilmember Philsott,
I was just going to comment, as long as staff's okay with 4 to 6, 4 to 6 is fine. So yes.
I might just comment that we might clarify in the recommendation, the 4 to 6 is not in accordance with the new state law requirements. I don't think, unless those were clauses.
sorry, say that again.
I'm not sure. I just want staff to clarify.
State law doesn't say you can't do it less than 5 years, does it?
It says up every 8 years.
Every 8 years.
So the state requirement, you're correct, is it has to be done at least once every 8 years,
Right.
starting this year. Yeah.
It doesn't say you're not allowed to do it every 2 years.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, Lydia?
Yes, I was going to say, instead of in accordance, maybe in compliance with new state law.
Sure.
Thank you, Councilmember Cook, or Vice Mayor Cook. Yeah.
So I don't know if you caught that change. In
I'm sorry, can you
C,
restate that change?
accordance to compliance.
No, in compliance with new state law. So delete accordance.
Okay, so Councilmember Philsott voted yes. Councilmember Ku,
Vote again?
do you vote yes?
Yes.
And I'll vote yes. Okay, so let's move on to recommendations 2, 5, and 6. Anybody want to start?
Let's see. I'll move that we increase the land valuation to $17.6 million an acre based on the average of the lot. So I'll move 2C by itself for the moment.
So I have a question, I guess, for staff. So when we talk about a feasibility study, are we talking about only housing? Or are we talking about every land use?
We would do every land use if we went with 17.6.
Okay, so it sounds like we've been trying to approve these impact fees possibly before July. We would definitely not be able to do that, it sounds like.
So the Nexus study itself with the 17.6 million valuation could potentially be itself, the document could be approved by July 1st because the consultant has obviously done the calculations already. The fees themselves don't have to be adopted by July 1st.
The fees do not? Is that what you're saying?
No,
Okay,
just the Nexus study supplement. And that's only if you want to stick with per unit for housing fees.
okay.
Yeah.
So if we take Councilmember Philsott's motion on 2C, what happens with 5 and 6? Do we need to replace those with a feasibility study?
So if I may recommend, if you would like to go with 2C, perhaps then you would replace 5 and 6 with direct staff to conduct a economic feasibility study on the using the new Nexus study.
Okay. And again, that feasibility study would look at a range of levels below that, right? It's not just looking at that one.
It would be similar to your economic feasibility study that was done on the linkage fees in 2021.
Okay. Or do you want to add that? Or?
I was going to suggest we just do that and then move and then have a discussion on the disposition of 5 and 6. But if this is, I'm okay with this.
The feasibility.
With a feasibility study, yeah.
Do you have any comments or questions?
I just, I mean, the alternative is we go back to, the people we work for and tell them, yeah, value of an acre of land in Palo Alto, $6.5 million. Now, I'm personally not prepared to do that.
Yeah.
Our hands are tied. I can't do that. It's not true. I don't care what they say in Sacramento. It's not true. I won't do it.
So the feasibility study is just on the housing production, or
No,
is it on other developments?
It's everything.
It's everything.
Okay, I mean, I'll second the motion. And
I mean, can I,
just,
can I speak a little bit?
Sure.
further? You know, I think, this, I mean, the immovable object and the irresistible force are drawn closer to each other, okay? But, that's out of our control, okay? I suspect that one of these days, if we go down this path, Sacramento's going to come back and they're going to issue a statewide mandate on what park requirements acreage per resident is statewide. I mean, if they're going down this path, eventually they're going to get to this stuff, and maybe they should, right? But that's beyond our control. All we can do is tell the truth to our constituents.
yeah, and again, I'm seconding this just because I
And if they got a problem, they should go complain to Mark Berman, and that's the right escalation mechanism.
Right. I mean, I do think this is closer. I think we're even seeing some recent projects where it's closer to 20 million an acre.
Oh, yeah.
And again,
But yeah, if I can add one thing. If you guys find some land in Mountain View that's only worth 4 million an acre, let me know because I want to invest.
the other thing I wanted to add though is we keep saying parks, but that's kind of shorthand, right? This is community centers, libraries, and everything. So.
I think we would suggest that you also include the park dedication in lieu fee, which is a fee charged on certain subdivision projects instead of the park impact
include the
fee.
Quimby Act?
Yeah, the Quimby Act
Yeah,
fee,
that's-
because it relies on the same valuation.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Well, you know what, now that you bring it up, it's the subdivision part of it, right, for the in lieu fees. In order to gain more, so if we're gonna do in lieu fees and also, and then also considering whether they give us parkland, just like when we are having a subdivision and we're asking for BMR units, BMR units are more favorable than the in lieu fees. Is this something that we want to consider? Getting the parkland versus getting the in lieu fees? Or is this outside of our discussion?
Yeah, John, maybe you can help with that on how the city looks at that issue.
Sorry, I would, Vice Mayor, would you mind repeating your question?
In terms of the Quimby Act, parkland dedication in lieu fee, should we be evaluating it and deciding to require land dedication for parks instead of taking the in lieu fee? I liken that to the below market rate housing, where we prefer to have below market rate housing instead of the in lieu fee.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't have the answer for you. That's certainly something that we can take and from the committee and investigate on this when this goes to council. I do think options are important. Not everybody who's developing is going to have land accessible for dedication, and it may be fractions or portions of land. So I think in this particular instance, the fee option is probably set up this way for that particular reason, but it's certainly worth exploring.
Last question. In the subdivision in our municipal code, the 50 parcels that is stated here, is this our decision? Was it the council's decision for them passed, or is it a state law?
Yeah, we didn't prepare for our Quimby Act. I didn't study up on that because it's really not on the agenda. John, do you know off the top of your head?
50 is the number for the Quimby Act.
Yep.
Oh,
That's
so
my
it is
sense is
law.
that it's in the state law, but we can confirm that with you.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Okay, so can we go ahead and vote on this motion? I'll vote yes. Councilmember Koo,
Yes,
Councilmember Filson.
Yes.
Okay, so that passes 3-0. And now we have the recommendations 3 and 4. So, 3 here is this decision on, do we want to keep a per unit price versus square foot? And then 4, is the idea that we would defer multifamily, which we're already, I guess, preparing the economic feasibility study, right? So I think we've covered that one. So it's really, do we want to make a recommendation to council on square footage? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I like the idea of moving to a square footage base. And let me lay out an argument why. And I think there's 2. One is that the argument that the consultant, the DTA presented, which is, all housing units are not created alike. It's more likely that a 4-bedroom townhouse is going to have more people in it than a 1-bedroom studio. Okay. So why should the impact fees be the same for a 4-bedroom townhome as a 1-bedroom studio? Because the first one's likely to have more people in it than the second one, and the people are the impact, right? That, per our comp plan and so forth. So that's the technical argument, which I agree with. The philosophical argument is that per unit it's a regressive thing, right? In general, people with higher incomes are more likely to live in larger spaces than people with lower incomes, right? And so if the people with lower incomes, again, it's a correlation, not causation, but if the people with lower incomes pay the same as the people with higher incomes, what we got is a regressive fee. And I don't think as a society, right, most Palo Altans favor that. I think it should be progressive. I think most Palo Altans favor a progressive approach to these things. And so I think that also argues in favor of a per square footage kind of thing. And whether it's a single family home or a multi-unit, I don't have a terribly strong opinion on one way or the other. I think to Tom's point, we're just not making it, or maybe it was Jonathan's, we're just not making a lot of new single family homes anymore. We have tear downs and replace the same ones, but we're not adding them. And, of the 6,000 units in our arena target, basically 0 of them are going to be filled with single family homes, right? So I think multi-unit is where the focus and our attention should be. Yeah, so I think whether we treat those separately or the same in the square footage rate, I don't have a terribly strong opinion on. If other people on the group have insight into this, then let's have that. Let's discuss that.
I guess just to play devil's advocate, I think maybe the one reason to think about per unit is just, do you just drive the market to smaller and smaller units and decrease family housing?
Probably, but
Yeah.
it's economics, right? And
Yeah. That's
the nature of progressive versus regressive, right?
It just amplifies it if every fee is. Actually, I had a question for staff. So if we have a tear down of a single family and we move to square foot and they build a larger house, then do they pay fees on the increased square footage?
Yes.
And then the way it is,
They probably pay fees on the same square footage. Or if you tear down a 2,000 square foot house and put up a 2,000 square foot one, you probably pay fees on 2,000 square feet.
do you pay a per unit fee if you do a rebuild?
I think I'll defer to John on that.
No, it would be the net new square footage.
Right. So today, if it was a per unit fee, they've already paid that, or would they have to pay it again?
That's right. No, it's paid.
Okay. So it's a difference.
If they build a smaller house, do they get a refund?
Okay. So I don't know. Lydia, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I'm going with the square footage.
Okay. Does staff have any comments? I mean, do you prefer the square footage?
Tim, do you want to speak to the timing of square footage if we adopt new fees in the July 1st date?
So if the finance committee recommends to council to move to a square footage basis, that would require some reworking of the Nexus study to calculate that out. We wouldn't be bound by the July 1st deadline because we're moving anyway to the square footage. In the meantime, the current fee would exist and would go up by its escalator. I think it's tied to the construction index until the council adopts the updated fees, which wouldn't be in this budget cycle, obviously, but hopefully by the next one.
So again, just to be crystal clear, I mean, the way this recommendation 4 was written was that the feasibility study would need to be done for housing. And it seemed to imply that we could change the rates for all the other uses, but tonight you're telling us that's not true.
Yeah, we had a lot of cooks in the kitchen and these things come together at the last minute and we apologize. This was not as clear for the committee as it should have been. But the decision that you're recommending to council tonight is very sound. And I think it will serve the city well to go ahead and get that Nexus study for all the types and then come back and adopt the fees. And I'm hopeful, I'm not on the operations side, but I'm hopeful that's like a fall timeframe thing. It's not, it's a doable thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry to just carp on this again. Also, per square foot's going to be the law of the land anyway. Okay. It's simple. Okay. And I think there's a finite possibility that between all the stuff going on with housing in this state, we're headed for chaos. Okay. And we'll be best positioned in such an eventuality if we got all our stuff real clean and crisp and clear and simple, and we're not using this to subsidize that and this other thing to account for these 3 other things and so forth. Just make it all, get it all clean and simple. Okay. It's our best defense against sort of a storm coming.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I think it's wise. And to the extent that any property owner, if it's a commercial or a hotel, wants to challenge the city, we want to have our studies completed and clear. And that will be what a court will rely on to evaluate what we've done.
Plus, the more complicated it is, the easier it is to manipulate your game, right? And especially, we're going to get nothing but complexity coming from, all kinds of other places around here. So,
should we go ahead and accept this Nexus report though, just to preserve the ability for the full council?
So we could.
I mean, if we're recommending the square footage, they could decide that's not what they want. And then if we accepted the Nexus report.
Yeah, either way. So the committee doesn't have the power to adopt the Nexus report. It's a recommendation to council. So I think the recommendation that focuses on moving to square footage makes sense. And if council wants to say, no, we do want to go ahead and adopt the current Nexus study to hold it in place before July 1, then they can just go ahead and do that.
This is the supplement to the Nexus study, right?
I think that's what it's called.
Yes.
Did we accept ever in the past when we've passed the other 5 point?
Yes.
Yes, I guess, are we good with the July date already or not?
So if the Nexus study this is a supplement to the Nexus study that was completed, I think in 2021, which established the $5.4 million valuation. Under our current code, that amount, the fee based on that amount goes up every year based on construction index, I think. So the fee is going to go up even if you do nothing. As long as it's adopted in the regular budget process, you still have to do that. If you want to preserve the option for the full council, what we could do is have the Nexus study with the 17.6 million and the per unit housing kind of ready for them if they want to choose to adopt that, the supplement at that point. And they can do that, but at the same time say, but we're not going to set any fees yet based on that. And, and then they could, continue to adopt your recommendations in full and say, the fee is going to be the status quo for now. We want you to go forward with this work that we've directed you to do. And say, hopefully by next budget cycle, we'll have new fees based on the 17.6 million, lowered by potentially by some amount as directed by the economic feasibility study, and on a per square foot basis for housing.
Okay. So I guess I'll make the motion here. If we could recommend that council accepts the Nexus report update, and the finance committee recommends to council that we convert the residential fees to reflect the per square foot amount. And
Right, exactly.
yeah, I think that's how it works, right?
So
It's
just.
getting harder to tell there's a single family home and a townhome and a condo and so forth.
Yeah. Well, that's the example here, which is based on square footage, right?
So
Second.
the committee is unanimous on your recommendation. So one way this could work is for it to go onto the council's consent agenda, to switch to square footage and then do the economic feasibility. If council's fine with that, that authorization is adopted at a consent level before the council break, and we're off doing that work and coming back after the break. No, we want to go ahead and adopt the feasibility study on the per unit basis on the residential. They'll need to pull it from consent and do that. And before, it has to get on one of your very crowded agendas then in May or June.
I actually kind of like that because then it gives basically the mayor the option, right, and the rest of the council, whether they want to hear it or not.
Yes.
So again, on this motion, I think we want to delete number 4 because I think we covered it already. And then should we add something here about adding that we accept the Nexus report update? Or is it?
No, because it will be further updated to account for the square footage. And so you'll do that when it comes back with the economic feasibility study all at one time. Yes? Yes.
Okay.
So then what it'll mean for the meantime, for say the upcoming budget cycle, is that the existing fee will just be increased by the construction index multiplier, and that the park fees and the other community and library fees will just still be in place as is for now.
So can we update the fee at any time once we finish the feasibility study? Or is it on an annual basis?
You can update it basically anytime, as long as it's within the various procedural processes under the Mitigation Fee Act. So it is kind of a slow process. There's certain noticing and time requirements, but you can basically change it anytime.
There are like 60-day waiting periods for some of the stuff, but that's still, as Tim alluded to, procedural. So if we brought it on any given Monday council meeting, we can start that clock. It doesn't have to wait for the budget process.
Okay.
I'll second it.
Are we ready? Are you seconded?
Mhm.
Thank you. Are we ready to vote on this one?
I vote yes.
Vice Mayor Ku?
Yes.
And I will vote yes. So it passed unanimously.
Let me make, if I can, make one more comment on the square footage and your quite accurate comment that it sort of, benefits little tiny units as opposed to big family ones. Right? We're like all cities. struggling with what Sacramento tells us to do versus what's right for our community. And sometimes those are aligned and sometimes they're not. Okay. For better or for worse, Sacramento is telling us, build lots of little tiny units, okay, and pay for them with commercial development that creates more demand than supply. That is what Sacramento is telling us to do, okay? They don't say that in words, but that's what their policies and their bills and their regulations do, okay? You know, we got to pick our battles, okay? We're not going to be able to fight Sacramento on everything. So if they're telling us to build little tiny units, it may be that that's one of the battles that we don't fight as hard.
May I just ask staff about when they, oh, I guess it's not coming to council. It's going to go to consent.
Well, I was just going to ask, so will staff make it clear in the staff report that if they want to change it, they have to pull it?
Just a point I wanted to make on slide 13, when Mr. Tosek was giving the formula of how they came up with the per square foot pricing, it was very interesting. And if he was ever to come back with a presentation, it would be great if he can also write it down, include it in the report. Can't see.
Okay, so I think that ends this item.
Thank you.
Next thing is upcoming agendas, which I think hopefully we all know is 2 full days of fun. Starting on May 10th.
Yep.
Any comments on those meetings or?
No, just, you know, bring your books and your patience and we will roll through them. They both start at 9 a.m. And so we will see you there bright and early, and they will be hybrid meetings for public, staff, and folks' participation.
And we're
in
going to
general.
meet in the community room.
Yes, we are planning on meeting in the community meeting room and are testing the equipment now. The backup will be council chambers if for some reason something fails.
Will there be donuts or do we bring our own?
I'm pretty sure the city clerk will accommodate requests, so.
Beer?
Don't within city regulations.
I'll bring those.
But yes, there are breaks for, if you see the schedule, there are breaks, significant breaks for lunch, both to accommodate overruns as well as the assumption that we'll need to frankly stretch our legs and take a minute. Okay.
Okay. I think with that, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks,
Tosek.
Thanks to DTA.
Yeah.